Good evening, dear friends. My name is Eleanor, and if you've ever been told, by a person, by a circumstance, by life itself, that you were finished, that your best years were behind you, that nobody needed a woman your age anymore, then I need you to stay with me tonight, because I'm going to tell you what happened to me at 72 years old, and I promise you, you will not see it coming. It was a Tuesday morning in November when my marriage of 38 years ended. Not with a fight, not with tears or accusations, or the dramatic unraveling you might imagine after nearly 4 decades of shared life. It ended the way Douglas Harrington did most things he'd already decided. Quietly, efficiently, and without asking for my opinion. I was standing at this kitchen counter of our home on Birchwood Drive in Charleston, South Carolina, the home I had kept spotless for 38 years. The home where I had cooked Sunday pot roasts and ironed dress shirts and raised a daughter and buried small griefs in the backyard of my own silence. When Douglas set a yellow manila envelope on the oak table, poured himself a cup of coffee, and said without turning around, "Eleanor, I've filed for divorce. My attorney has prepared everything." He said it the way you'd say the car needs an oil change. Informational. Already resolved. I looked at that envelope for a long moment before I touched it. The return address in the upper left corner was a law firm I didn't recognize. My name was printed on the front in clean black type. Eleanor May Harrington. Not handwritten. Printed. As if I were a stranger receiving official correspondence. Inside were divorce papers, already prepared, already organized with little sticky tabs marking where a signature would eventually be required. The top sheet said, in the careful language of legal documents, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." Douglas's name. My name. 38 years reduced to a filing number in the upper right corner. My hands did not shake. I want to be clear about that. I had grown up in a household where you did not shake. My mother was a school teacher in rural Georgia who had raised 3 children through things that would make a lesser woman fold, and she had taught me by example, not instruction, that composure was not the absence of feeling. It was the decision to feel things on your own terms, in your own time. So my hands did not shake. But something inside me, something I can only describe as the structural belief that the ground beneath you is solid, shifted, quietly, permanently, like a foundation settling after a long rain. I need to tell you about Douglas and about the life we had, so you understand what that envelope actually meant. I met Douglas Harrington in the autumn of 1985 at a parent-teacher conference at the elementary school where I'd been teaching 2nd grade for 6 years. He was a widower, 41 years old, with a contractor's confidence and the kind of steady, straightforward handsomeness that makes a woman believe a man before she has reason not to. I was 39, and I had been a widow for 8 years. My first husband, William Thomas Satterley, had died in 1977, or so I had believed for nearly 5 decades. But I'll come to that. After William, I raised our daughter Diane on my own for 6 years. I taught school. I paid bills. I made a life that was smaller than I'd imagined, but solid and mine. And when Douglas Harrington sat across from me at that parent-teacher conference and asked if I'd like to have coffee sometime, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time, the possibility of a second chapter. For many years, Douglas seemed like exactly that. We built a comfortable life in Charleston. His contracting business did well through the late 80s and 90s. I taught school for another 23 years before I retired. We took vacations to the Outer Banks, attended Diane's school events, argued over the thermostat, and did all the small ordinary things that constitute a shared existence. I was not a romantic fool. I knew Douglas had a temper, that he could be dismissive in public in ways that stung but could be explained away, that he sometimes treated my opinions as pleasant background noise rather than actual input. But I told myself no marriage was perfect. I told myself that was just Douglas. That was just the way he was. That was love. The property arrangements I never thought to question until it was too late. Early in our marriage, Douglas had explained, sensibly, practically, that it made more financial sense for the major assets to be in his name. Tax reasons. Business liability reasons. I was a school teacher with a modest income and a deep, trained trust in the man sleeping beside me. So the house on Birchwood Drive was in his name. The cars were in his name. The investment accounts he managed were in his name. I had my teacher's pension. I had my personal savings. I had 38 years of assuming that what was his was also mine. I was wrong about that. The divorce settlement, 8 months of legal proceedings that left me exhausted in ways I hadn't expected, made the reality very plain. I received $18,000 in my personal belongings. Douglas kept the house, the cars, and the accounts. The judge allowed it because the titles and the paperwork said what they said, and paperwork does not care about 38 years of Sunday pot roasts. By January, I was living in room 14 of the Magnolia Road Inn on the edge of town. I want to describe room 14 to you because I think it matters. The carpet was the color of old mustard and smelled of decades of other people's lives, their cigarettes and their sadness and their temporary circumstances. The heater rattled when it came on, a sound like something trapped trying to get out. The bed had a spring on the left side that made itself known at approximately 2 in the morning every single night, without fail. The window looked out onto the parking lot, and the light from the gas station across the street came through the thin curtains in a way that made it never quite dark. I was 72 years old. I had $18,000, a prepaid cell phone, a suitcase of clothes, and a box of books and photographs that Diane was keeping in her garage in North Charleston. I sat on that mustard carpet on my first night, and I gave myself 1 hour to feel every terrible thing that needed to be felt. The humiliation, the disbelief, the specific grief of a woman who realizes she had been slowly disappearing inside a life for decades without fully understanding it was happening. And then I heard through Diane, who had heard from a mutual acquaintance, what Douglas had said at a dinner party the week after the divorce was finalized. Someone had mentioned my name, and Douglas had laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Eleanor? She's fine. She can take care of herself. Who needs a 72-year-old woman anyway? She should have made herself more interesting 20 years ago." I sat with those words in room 14 and I let them land exactly where they were aimed. I didn't push them away. I didn't argue with them inside my own head. I let them hurt the way they needed to hurt. And then I folded them up, put them somewhere cold inside myself, and started thinking about next steps. Because that is what my mother's daughter does. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late February. The sky was the flat gray of a day that hasn't decided what it wants to do, and there was the smell of rain coming from somewhere over the harbor. I was sitting in the small lobby of the Magnolia Road Inn, holding a magazine I wasn't reading, doing the particular kind of not thinking that a person does when they are actually thinking very hard about things they can't solve. The door opened. A man walked in, perhaps 52, 53, wearing a navy suit that had been pressed with the care of someone who meant what he wore as a kind of professional statement. He carried a black leather briefcase. He walked to the front desk and spoke to the clerk, and what he said made me look up. "I'm looking for a Mrs. Eleanor May Harrington. I was told she might be staying here." I put the magazine down slowly. He turned, and his eyes found me with the focused attention of someone who had been looking for a specific face and had just found it. He crossed the lobby and stopped in front of me. "Mrs. Harrington? My name is Arthur Fleming. I'm an estate attorney from Seattle. I've been trying to locate you for some time." He sat down across from me in one of the cracked lobby chairs, set his briefcase on his knees, and opened it with the unhurried precision of a very organized man. He removed a folder. He looked at me with careful eyes, the eyes of a person who delivers difficult information professionally and has learned not to rush it. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, "your first husband, William Thomas Satterley, passed away on January the 3rd of this year, in Tacoma, Washington." I looked at him. "William died in 1977, I said. My voice was level, steady. Arthur Fleming shook his head, slowly, deliberately. "No, ma'am, he did not. William Satterley survived. He left Charlotte in the spring of 1977 under circumstances I'll explain in full. He lived under a variation of his name in the Pacific Northwest for 46 years. He passed away on January the 3rd. He paused. He left an estate valued at approximately $53 million. Outside, the rain began. I could hear it on the lobby's single window. Tentative at first, then certain. "You are named as the sole primary beneficiary," Arthur Fleming said. He paused once more. "There is, however, one condition." The magazine slipped from my lap. I didn't pick it up. I did not sleep that night. I lay on the rattling bed in room 14. The spring found my ribs at 2 in the morning as it always did, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and tried to arrange the facts into something that held together. William Satterley, my William. The young man who used to stop at the roadside on the way to my mother's house and pick wildflowers because he couldn't afford a florist. The man who had kissed my forehead on a January morning in 1977 before he went out. I had believed it was the last morning. And who had never come home. He had not died. He had left. And for 46 years he had lived a different life in the Pacific Northwest, while I had grieved him, buried an empty coffin in my heart, remarried, raised a daughter, grown old, and ended up in a motel room with a spring in the mattress and $18,000 between me and nothing. I gave myself until dawn to grieve the version of the past I'd believed in for nearly 5 decades. Not just the loss of William. I had already grieved that long ago. This was something else. This was the grief of discovering that the thing you mourned had not been real, that the shape of your own history was different from the shape you thought it was. I sat up when the first pale light came through the curtains. I made instant coffee on the little motel kettle. It tasted like hot water with ambitions. And I sat at the edge of the bed and made myself stop asking why. Why had William left? What had I done or not done that had made a man choose to vanish rather than simply say goodbye? What kind of woman does that make me, to have been left twice by 2 different men in 2 entirely different ways? Those questions would circle forever if I let them. I knew that. I had learned at 72 that certain questions don't have answers that help you. They only have answers that wound you over and over in the same place. So I stopped asking why, and I started asking what. What was the condition attached to the inheritance? What would it require of me? What were my actual options in the next 60 days? Arthur Fleming had given me his card and said he would return the following morning at 10. I had the intervening hours to think clearly about what I was actually working with. My situation, examined without drama, was this. I had approximately $14,000 remaining from the divorce settlement after 2 months of motel bills and living expenses. My room at the Magnolia Road Inn was paid through the end of the week. I had no car. I had a prepaid cell phone and a box of books and photographs at Diane's house. I had mild arthritis in my right knee, reasonable health for my age, a teacher's pension that covered modest basics, and a quality that Douglas had always found irritating, but which had never once let me down. I was stubborn in the particular way of a woman who has survived things. That morning, that stubbornness felt like the most valuable thing I owned. He arrived at 10 exactly. He brought coffee from the diner down the road. 2 cups black, in paper cups with plastic lids. It was a small gesture. I noticed it and appreciated it. A person who brings coffee to a meeting in a motel lobby is a person who is paying attention to the human being across from them, and not just the transaction. We sat in the lobby again. He laid out documents with the organized care of someone who had prepared thoroughly and respected my ability to follow. William Satterley, Arthur explained, had left Charlotte in the spring of 1977, not because of any accident or illness, but because of a financial catastrophe of his own making. He had invested in a business venture that had collapsed, and the collapse had left him owing money to people who were not patient creditors. He had been 28 years old, frightened and overwhelmed, and instead of facing the situation, he had run. He had not, Arthur was careful to say, formally staged his death. He had simply left and allowed the assumption of his death to take hold because he had not corrected it. It was, Arthur said, using the word plainly and without apology on William's behalf, cowardly. William had rebuilt his life in Tacoma under his middle name, going by James, and using his mother's maiden name professionally. He had entered the logistics industry, made careful investments over 4 decades, and died a wealthy man. He had never remarried. He had kept in his personal effects a single photograph of Eleanor, their wedding day, May 17, 1973. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked about the condition. Because William had never been formally declared dead and no death certificate had ever been issued, the probate situation required verification. To claim the estate as stated in his will, which had been written 8 years before his death and updated twice since, I would need to formally attest to my identity as his original wife and lawful spouse at the time of his disappearance, submit to a review of our original marriage documentation, and appear in person at a probate hearing in Tacoma within 60 days. The estate would cover all travel, legal fees, and reasonable living expenses during the process. Arthur also explained that he would be serving as the estate attorney throughout, handling documentation and the formal estate process. while a separate probate litigation attorney named Raymond Holloway, based in Tacoma, would represent my interests if any legal challenges arose. 2 men, 2 distinct roles, both working toward the same outcome. "I'll do it," I said. Arthur Fleming nodded as if he had expected precisely that answer. He told me I would need to gather whatever original documents I still had from my marriage to William. The marriage certificate if I had it. Photographs, letters, anything that established our history. I knew exactly where those things were. There was a small tin box at the bottom of the storage carton at Diane's house. I had carried it with me through every move of my adult life without ever opening it, because opening it had always felt like pressing on a bruise that had never quite finished healing. Now, I would need to open it. I called Diane that afternoon. Our relationship had become strained in the months since the divorce. Not because she had taken Douglas's side, but because grief and shame have a way of making people hard to reach, even the people who love them. I had been keeping Diane at a careful distance without meaning to, the way you sometimes protect the people you love most from the extent of your own undoing. I told her I needed to come by and collect something from the carton in her garage. I did not tell her why. Not yet. I needed to understand the full shape of this before I shared it with anyone, because I had learned at 72 that other people's reactions, even loving ones, have a way of colonizing your thinking before you've had time to form it properly. The tin box was exactly where I remembered it, on a metal shelf in Diane's garage, between a bag of garden soil and a box of Christmas ornaments. It was smaller than I remembered. Rust had started at the corners. I opened it for the first time in decades. Inside, our marriage certificate, dated May 17th, 1973. 5 black and white photographs, William and me at the courthouse, at a friend's backyard party, at the beach in the summer of 1974, young and unguarded and entirely unaware of what was coming. 4 letters William had written me during a summer job he'd taken in Asheville before we were married, the handwriting young and a little uncertain, the words earnest in the way only very young men allow themselves to be before life teaches them to guard things. And at the very bottom, folded inside a piece of notebook paper, a pressed wildflower, dried to near translucence after 50 years, delicate as tissue paper. He had picked it from the roadside. I had forgotten that I'd kept it, or perhaps I had simply never let myself remember. I held it with great care. I did not cry. I was making a plan. The flight to Tacoma was the first time I had been on an airplane in 11 years. Douglas had stopped wanting to travel sometime in the mid-2000s, and I had accommodated that the way I had accommodated so many of his preferences, quietly, without much examination of whether I was accommodating because I wanted to or simply because it was easier. I sat in the window seat and watched Charleston disappear beneath the clouds, and I felt something I had not been expecting. Lightness. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. But the specific sensation of a door opening onto a hallway you hadn't known was there. The sense that the space available to you had just become, without warning, larger than you thought. Arthur Fleming had arranged a clean, quiet hotel near the probate attorney's office in downtown Tacoma. The room was warm. The bed was firm. The window looked out onto a row of bare-limbed trees along a wet sidewalk, silver in the January light. It was more dignified than anything I'd inhabited in months. I took a long bath that first evening simply because I could, and because dignity matters, even in its smallest and most private forms, perhaps especially then. Raymond Holloway met me at his office the following morning with Arthur Fleming present. Raymond was mid-50s, methodical, with the contained energy of a person who thinks faster than he speaks and has learned that patience is a strategic asset. He went through the documents I'd brought with careful attention and asked precise questions. The marriage certificate, the photographs, the letters. He noted that the handwriting in William's letters matched samples already in the estate's personal files. He photographed everything and told me the formal hearing would be scheduled within 3 weeks. Then he said, "Mrs. Harrington, there's something you should know before we proceed." He looked at me over his reading glasses. William Satterley had a daughter, from a relationship in the early 1980s. Her name is Natalie Satterley. She's 49 years old and lives in Portland. She was not named in the will. I absorbed this. "Has she been notified?" I asked. "She has," said Raymond. "She was informed of the estate and its terms approximately 3 weeks before we located you." 3 weeks. Natalie Satterley had known about the inheritance, and about me, For 3 weeks before Arthur Fleming had walked into the lobby of the Magnolia Road Inn. I thought about what 3 weeks of knowing gives a person. 3 weeks to consult attorneys. 3 weeks to plan. 3 weeks to prepare for the arrival of a 72-year-old woman with a tin box and a pressed wildflower and a marriage certificate from 1973. I was not, by nature, a suspicious woman, but I was no longer a naive one either. "I see," I said. I kept my voice very even, and I filed the information away in the cold, careful place where I was keeping the things that mattered. 3 days later, my phone rang. A Portland area code, a voice I had never heard before. Controlled, precise, with something tight running beneath it like a wire pulled taut. "Is this Eleanor Harrington?" "It is," I said. "My name is Natalie Satterley," the voice said. "I think we need to talk." She chose the location. A coffee shop in the Pearl District of Portland, what she called neutral ground, which told me immediately that she had thought about this meeting carefully enough to use that phrase. Neutral ground is what you say when you've already decided there are sides. I agreed to meet. Then I immediately called Raymond Holloway and told him. He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do this," he said. "She has no legal standing to contest the will independently. Not yet." "I know," I said, "but I want to see what she wants." What Natalie Satterley wanted became clear within the first 5 minutes. She was already seated when I arrived. A tall woman, angular, with the kind of composed stillness that comes from preparation rather than nature. She had her father's coloring. I saw that immediately, and it was a strange thing, like catching a glimpse of a face you once loved in a funhouse mirror. The features recognizable, but the expression entirely different. William, whatever his faults, and they were considerable, had never possessed the particular coldness I saw in Natalie's eyes when she looked at me across that table. She had brought her boyfriend, a man she introduced as Owen Bradshaw. He said nothing throughout the entire meeting, but sat with the alert, contained watchfulness of someone waiting to be useful in a way that hadn't been specified yet. We ordered coffee we were both too focused to properly taste. Then Natalie began. "You were married to my father for 4 years, she said. 50 years ago, I lived with him. I took care of him in his final years. I managed his house, his appointments, his affairs. That must have meant a great deal to him," I said carefully. "He left me nothing." Something behind her eyes hardened. "Not the house, not the accounts, not $1. Everything to you. A woman he hadn't seen in half a century." "I didn't know he was alive," I said. She looked at me steadily. "So you've said." I noticed then that she was watching my hands, specifically watching to see whether they trembled. I kept them still and relaxed around my coffee cup. "Eleanor," she said, first name, no courtesy title, a deliberate informality meant to establish something. "I'm going to be direct with you. I think you should consider a voluntary settlement before this becomes something that's difficult for everyone." "How much?" I asked. She named a figure without hesitation. $18 million in exchange for me stepping back from the probate process entirely, allowing the estate to fall into a default state from which she could then advance her own claim as a de facto caregiver dependent. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about room 14 at the Magnolia Road Inn. I thought about the marriage certificate dated May 17, 1973. I thought about a wildflower pressed inside a piece of notebook paper, kept for 50 years by a man who had never stopped knowing what he'd done. "I'll need to think about it," I said. I had absolutely no intention of thinking about it, but I needed to know what she would do when she didn't get an immediate answer. I found out sooner than I expected. The days after that first meeting had a particular quality. Every small, ordinary thing felt both fragile and valuable in the way things do when you've just been reminded they can be taken. I moved through my hotel routines carefully, paying attention, noticing. Which is why, when I returned to my hotel room that evening, I knew immediately that someone had been inside it. Nothing was taken. My documents, the marriage certificate, the photographs, the letters, were all in a lockbox at Raymond Holloway's office, where they had been since the day after I arrived. But I knew my own room. I was a woman who had spent decades living with a man who dismissed my perceptions, who told me I was imagining things, who used the phrase, "You're too sensitive," as a way of ending conversations he didn't want to have. That experience, as painful as it had been, had sharpened something in me. I noticed things, I noticed them precisely because I had spent years being told I didn't. The angle of my reading glasses on the nightstand, the position of the small toiletry bag on the bathroom counter, the way the edge of my suitcase sat against the wall, half an inch further out than I had left it. I did not touch anything. I took photographs of the entire room with my cell phone, every surface, every detail, before I moved a single object. Then I called Raymond Holloway. Then I called the hotel manager. The manager reviewed the key card entry log for my room. It showed an access during a 90-minute window that afternoon, while I had been sitting across a coffee shop table in Portland, looking at Natalie Satterley's careful, watchful face. Raymond was at my hotel within 40 minutes. He examined the log documentation and the photographs I'd taken. "This goes into the legal record tonight," he said, "and we file a report with the Tacoma Police Department tomorrow morning." "Do it," I said. The next morning, Arthur Fleming arranged for me to move to a different hotel. Smaller, less conspicuous, the reservation made through the estate's account in a way that wasn't easily traceable. Raymond confirmed that if any further legal challenges arose, the hotel intrusion was now formally documented evidence. I settled into my new room, quieter, with a window that caught the morning light well, and began to think clearly about what I actually had and what was coming. It was Raymond who found it, while cataloging William's personal effects for the estate inventory. A journal, cloth-covered burgundy, filled with William's handwriting, entries made sporadically across more than 30 years, the handwriting changing gradually as the decades passed, growing more deliberate with age. Raymond called me on a Thursday morning and asked if I could come to his office that afternoon. I sat across from his desk and he placed the journal in front of me, open to a section he had marked with a small paper clip. He said nothing. He simply watched me with the patient, neutral expression of a man who understood that some moments require silence. The entry was dated autumn of 2003. William would have been 57 years old. I think about Eleanor more days than not. I wonder whether she is happy. I hope she is happy. I don't deserve to wonder about her, and I certainly don't deserve to hope anything on her behalf after what I did. But the wondering doesn't ask my permission. It just arrives, the way it always has. 26 years, and it still arrives. I read that twice. Then I turned the pages. There were other entries, not many, perhaps a dozen across the years, but each one carrying the careful, measured weight of a man writing about something he never said aloud. He wrote about regret without calling it regret, the way certain men do, circling it, describing its dimensions, without ever using the word directly. In an entry from 2009, she would have made something of her life. She always had that quality, the kind of stubbornness that looks like composure from a distance. I always admired it, and I think I was also a little frightened of it. A woman who knows who she is takes up a certain kind of space. I wasn't big enough to stand in it when I was 28. I've spent 30 years becoming someone who might have been. I set the journal down on Raymond's desk. I looked out his office window at the bare winter trees along the street. I held myself together with the focused concentration of someone handling something irreplaceable. I was not going to cry in a lawyer's office. I turned back to Raymond. "Can we use this?" "Yes," he said. "It's part of the estate's personal effects, entirely admissible as evidence of the testator's intent, and as context for the state of mind in which the will was written and updated." I nodded. "Good," I said. Inside, something very old and very complicated was shifting. The way a room looks different when the furniture is finally moved to where it should have been all along. Not resolved, not simple, but clarified. There was a small cafe 2 blocks from my hotel that I had begun visiting most mornings, not because the coffee was remarkable, though it was decent, but because it had a quality I found increasingly necessary during those weeks. It was quiet, it faced east, and the owner didn't play music before noon. There was a woman who sat at the corner table every morning between 8 and 9 o'clock, with a folded newspaper, and a small, elderly terrier who slept under her chair with the philosophical composure of a creature who had located his purpose in simply being present. The dog's name, I would eventually learn, was Biscuit. The woman was perhaps 66, compact and self-contained, with silver hair cut close and an expression of comfortable self-possession that I recognized instinctively as the look of a person who has done difficult things and knows it. We nodded at each other for 2 weeks before we spoke, the way people in shared small spaces do, acknowledging without requiring. The conversation began over a newspaper someone had left on the counter, a shared mild outrage about something in the national news, the kind of exchange that starts as small talk and then occasionally doesn't stay that way. Her name was Beverly Ashford, retired family law judge from Oregon, relocated from the East Coast 5 years prior. She came to this cafe every morning because she liked the light in the corner and the absence of music. When the conversation moved, as it does with certain people, with surprising speed, to what I was navigating, I told her briefly and without dramatic embellishment. Not because I needed to tell someone, but because Beverly was the kind of person who listened with her full attention in a way that made telling feel natural rather than exposing. She did not interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "You documented the hotel room before you touched anything?" "Yes," I said. "And you filed with local law enforcement?" The following morning, she nodded with the precise, contained approval of someone who had spent 30 years in courtrooms evaluating the quality of decisions under pressure. "You handled that exactly correctly," she said. Exactly. We began having breakfast together most mornings after that. Beverly never offered legal advice. She was careful and deliberate about keeping the boundary between friendship and counsel, and I respected that. But she listened with precision, asked questions that helped me organize my own thinking, and possessed the quality I most needed from another person in those weeks. She believed me without requiring me to convince her. She took me at my word as a woman who knew what had happened to her and what she intended to do about it. I hadn't realized until Beverly how much the preceding months had isolated me. The motel, the divorce, the particular shame that attaches itself to women who end up reduced by circumstances they couldn't fully control. The shame that whispers that somehow you should have prevented this, that a smarter woman, a better woman, would not have ended up here. Beverly's matter-of-fact, unremarkable presence reminded me that the shame was not a diagnosis. It was just weather. And weather passes. Some mornings she brought Biscuit, who would settle under our table and sleep through our entire conversation with the deep, untroubled sleep of a dog who had found his correct place in the world. Those mornings steadied me more than I could properly account for. 2 weeks after our meeting in the Pearl District, Natalie Satterley filed a formal contestation of the probate. Her attorney, a man named Gregory Whitfield, composed and expensive-looking, advanced 3 arguments: that William Satterley had experienced cognitive decline in his final years affecting his legal capacity, that Natalie, as his primary caregiver, represented his true practical dependence, and that my claim, as a woman who had not seen William in 46 years, constituted an exploitation of a prior legal status rather than a reflection of his genuine current intentions. Raymond read me the filing over coffee at his office. "It's emotionally ambitious," he said. "Legally, it's thin." "How thin?" I asked. "Thin enough that it will require response, but not enough to seriously threaten the outcome, provided we present our documentation clearly and the medical testimony holds." He then told me about Dr. Patricia Nolan, William's primary physician for the last 7 years of his life, who had already submitted a written statement to the estate confirming that William had been cognitively clear and legally competent throughout the entire period in which his will had been written and subsequently amended. The final amendment, made 18 months before William's death, had been witnessed by his attorney, his accountant, and Dr. Nolan herself. Natalie's mental diminishment argument was not just thin, it was going to collapse under documented medical testimony. I did not share any of this with Natalie's camp. I simply declined to respond beyond what Raymond's formal legal response required, and I waited. The call came on a Tuesday evening. Diane's voice was controlled in the particular way of someone trying very hard not to alarm the person they're calling, which alarmed me immediately. A man had come to her house in North Charleston that afternoon, well-dressed, polite, apologetic in manner. He said he was conducting routine due diligence on behalf of an estate interest and had a few brief questions he hoped she might help with. He had asked Diane about my mental health, about whether I had ever had issues with alcohol, about my behavior during my marriage to William. Had I been difficult? Cold? Had there been problems she was aware of? He had implied, without stating directly, that there were concerns being raised about my capacity to responsibly manage a large estate. Before he left, he had given Diane a business card. Owen Bradshaw, Bradshaw and Associates Investigations, Natalie's silent boyfriend from the Pearl District Cafe. I stayed calm on the phone. I reassured Diane. I told her she had done nothing wrong and that this would be handled. Then I said goodnight, ended the call, and sat in my hotel room for exactly 3 minutes with my hands folded in my lap. The anger I felt was not hot. It never has been for me. When I am genuinely, seriously angry, the kind of anger that means something is being protected, it goes cold. It becomes precise. It narrows everything down to what matters and strips away everything that doesn't. Natalie Satterley had sent a man to my daughter's house in another state to ask questions designed to make me look mentally unfit. She had used her boyfriend, a person on her payroll, to contact a potential witness during active probate proceedings. That was not grief. That was not the desperate action of a daughter who simply loved her father. That was someone who had decided that what she wanted was more important than what was true. The following morning, Raymond drafted a cease and desist letter to Gregory Whitfield, documenting Owen Bradshaw's visit as potential witness intimidation, and noting that Bradshaw was an employee of an investigations firm retained by Natalie 3 weeks before Eleanor Harrington had even been informed of the estate's existence. Whitfield responded that Owen had acted independently. Raymond noted for the record that Owen Bradshaw's business card identified him as an employee of the firm whose contract with Natalie was documented in her financial records, obtained through standard discovery. That was the second piece of direct evidence in the legal record. Natalie called me directly that evening. The careful control of our first meeting was gone. Her voice had shed its measured surface, and what was underneath was harder and less patient. "You're making this very difficult," she said. "I'm participating in a legal process," I replied. "I have resources. I have history with my father that you don't have and cannot replicate. I was there. You weren't. Not for 46 years you weren't. What you also have," I said, keeping my voice level, "is a documented unauthorized access to my hotel room on record with the Tacoma Police Department, and a documented contact with my daughter by a person in your employ, which Raymond Holloway has formally characterized as potential witness intimidation." There was a silence, then, "You're going to regret this." She ended the call. I opened a text message to Raymond. "She called me directly tonight." Threatening tone. "I'm fine. We should talk tomorrow." Then I put the phone down and looked out my window at the dark courtyard below, the bare trees holding their particular winter stillness. 13 days until the hearing. I was still standing. 9 days before the hearing, Natalie called again. This time her voice was warm, carefully engineered, with the performance of sincerity that you can hear if you've spent enough years listening for the difference between the real thing and its imitation. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about how things have gone between us, and I'm not proud of it. I'd like to meet again. Just the two of us. No attorneys, no Owen. I think we got off on the wrong foot, and I'd like to try something different." I held the phone and looked out my window. She is 9 days from losing everything she thought she was going to get, I thought. She is trying a new approach, because the old one hasn't worked. "All right," I said. "Where?" She chose a restaurant called Harbor View, a proper one, with linen napkins and a wine list, the kind of place chosen to project seriousness and stability. She was already seated when I arrived, wearing a good blazer, her hair done, a glass of water in front of her. She stood and offered her hand. We ordered food neither of us would properly taste. She began with an apology, structured, hitting the expected notes, emotionally articulate in a way that was impressive in its craftsmanship, even as I listened for what was underneath it. She had been overwhelmed by grief. She had acted rashly. She was sorry about Owen's visit to Diane. She was sorry about the hotel. She named these things carefully, not quite admitting to having ordered them, but acknowledging awareness of them. I listened. I ate my salad. I said I hear you at appropriate intervals. Then the pivot came, as I had known it would. She began describing her childhood, how William had moved in and out of her life unpredictably, how her mother had raised her largely alone, how she had chosen in adulthood to build a relationship with her father despite the difficulty, to show up, to stay, to be present when no one else was. She was positioning herself as the loyal daughter who had earned what Eleanor had simply been assigned by legal paperwork and old sentiment. And then, beneath the linen napkins and the careful warmth, the real argument surfaced. He was confused in his final years, more than the medical records show, because he was proud, and he hid it. "Eleanor." She said my name gently with manufactured compassion. The man who wrote that will was not entirely the man who should have been writing it. I put down my fork. "Natalie," I said, "I appreciate you reaching out. I mean that sincerely. But I want to be direct with you." I looked at her steadily and kept my voice even and clear. I am not going to withdraw from this probate process. I am not going to accept a partial settlement. I am going to the hearing in 9 days, and I intend to present my case, and I am confident in the outcome. I understand that's not what you came here to hear." Something shifted in her face. The warmth drained away like water from a tub. Quickly, completely. "You're making a mistake," she said. "You've said that to me before," I replied pleasantly. She leaned forward slightly, the pretense of warmth gone entirely. "I have things I haven't used yet. Things about the early years of your marriage to William, about why he really left." "Then bring them to the hearing," I said. "That's what it's for." "He left because you were cold," she said. "Because you were difficult. Because he told me his first marriage was suffocating. That you hadn't changed." I sat with that. I let it land exactly where it was intended to land, directly on the oldest, most uncertain place inside me. The version of me who had spent 38 years making herself smaller to keep Douglas comfortable might have flinched, might have found herself suddenly wondering if it was true. That woman was still inside me. I won't pretend she wasn't, but I did not let her speak. "Thank you for dinner," I said. I folded my napkin, placed it on the table, and reached for my coat. "I hope the next time we see each other is in a more formal setting." I walked out of Harborview with steady steps and did not look back. In the cab back to the hotel, I allowed myself to feel the fear I had kept behind my ribs throughout that dinner. It was real. Whatever William might have said to Natalie about our marriage could be shaped into something that sounded damning in a courtroom. Character testimony is a legitimate legal tactic even in probate proceedings. But I noticed, as the city moved past the cab window in the dark, that the fear was not collapsing me. It was sharpening me. I took out my phone and typed a message to Raymond. "She threatened additional character evidence at dinner tonight. We should discuss. I'm fine." Then I looked out at the lit streets of Tacoma passing in the rain, and I breathed, and I held myself together, and I thought, 9 more days. Beverly brought coffee to the cafe table that morning before I arrived. When I walked in, Biscuit lifted his head from under the table, regarded me with his customary philosophical calm, and went back to sleep. Beverly looked at me the way a person looks at someone they have been watching navigate something hard and have not once doubted. "How are you?" she asked. "Clear," I said, and meant it. She poured my coffee. "You know everything you need to know," she said. "Just say it plainly. Courts respond to plainness." I drank my coffee. Outside, the March morning was gray and still, with the particular held-breath quality of a day before something happens. The cherry trees along the street were just beginning, the faintest suggestion of pink at the tips of their branches, the kind of beginning so tentative you might mistake it for imagining. I did not mistake it. I put on my good coat, navy blue, wool, bought on my second day in Tacoma because I had decided that showing up to my own probate hearing in the garments of a woman in transition was not something I was willing to do. I picked up my bag. I walked out into the March morning. Raymond was waiting outside the courthouse. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," I said. The Pierce County Courthouse hearing room was smaller than its formal title suggested. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lighting supplemented by one high window that let in a strip of gray morning sky, rows of seats perhaps half filled with the various parties and their counsel. The judge was a man named Whitfield, precise, unimpressed, possessed of the particular patient authority of a person who has heard every variety of family dispute and found none of them, in the end, surprising. He was paying attention, but not to the drama, to the documents. I sat at the petitioner's table with Raymond Holloway. Natalie sat at the opposing table with Gregory Whitfield. She was composed, well-dressed, her expression arranged into something that managed to convey both grief and dignity simultaneously. A careful performance, skillfully maintained. Owen Bradshaw was in the gallery. I noted him, registered his presence, and set him aside. Arthur Fleming sat nearby, prepared to testify about the estate documentation and the circumstances of locating me. Beverly Ashford was not in the courtroom. This was not her place to be. But she had been at the cafe that morning, and she had made my coffee, and she had said what needed to be said. That was enough. That was exactly enough. The hearing proceeded with the formal, unhurried logic of legal process. Arthur Fleming testified first, clear and organized, establishing the chain of events from William's death through the location of Eleanor Harrington as the named beneficiary. His testimony was uncontested. Then Dr. Patricia Nolan's written deposition was entered into evidence and read aloud by Raymond. 3 pages of precise medical language that reduced to several unambiguous points. William Thomas Satterley had been cognitively clear and legally competent throughout the entire period, from the first writing of his will through its final amendment 18 months before his death. She had witnessed the final amendment herself, alongside William's attorney and accountant. The cognitive decline argument, the central pillar of Natalie's contestation, cracked under that testimony without a single dramatic moment. It simply became, in the record, a claim without medical support against a claim with thorough medical support. The difference in a courtroom is everything. William's personal attorney testified with the same unadorned clarity. William had been present, engaged, deliberate, and explicit about his intentions at every signing. He had asked questions. He had considered the implications. He had, on the occasion of the final amendment, made a specific comment that his attorney had noted at the time and now read into the record. He said, "I want this to be unambiguous. I want Eleanor to receive everything without difficulty. Make sure the language is precise." I kept my hands folded on the table in front of me and my expression composed, but I felt those words go through me like something warm. He had known this would not be simple. He had tried, from his distance of a man who would not be present for it, to protect me from exactly what was happening in this room. Gregory Whitfield presented Natalie's case with the polished competence of a skilled attorney working with materials that were not quite up to the quality of his presentation. Natalie testified about her father's final years. She was, I will give her this, a compelling witness. She described memory lapses and moments of confusion with vivid specificity, and perhaps she had genuinely observed some of what she described. The difficulty was that she had no medical documentation to support her characterizations, and Dr. Nolan's testimony sat in the record directly contradicting them. Then Gregory Whitfield approached the judge's bench with what he labeled Exhibit G, a letter, 4 handwritten pages in a protective sleeve. Whitfield described it with careful gravity, a personal letter from William to his daughter, written approximately 4 years before his death, in which the decedent had expressed uncertainty about the disposition of his estate and suggested that his intentions might benefit from reconsideration. Raymond requested time to examine the letter. Judge Whitfield granted it. Raymond took the letter to our table. He read it without expression, carefully, completely, taking every minute it deserved. Then he stood. He approached the judge's bench with the contained deliberateness of a man who has found what he was looking for and is choosing his moment. Your Honor, I'd like to note several characteristics in this document that appear inconsistent with authenticated samples of Mr. Satterley's handwriting across multiple documented sources from the same time period, including his personal journal, which is already in evidence, and correspondence with his attorney. I'd like to request that Exhibit G be submitted for independent forensic document examination before it's formally admitted into evidence. Whitfield objected, vigorously. Judge Whitfield looked at the letter, looked at Raymond, looked at the letter again. Objection overruled. Exhibit G is held pending forensic examination. We'll proceed. I allowed myself one slow breath. Across the room, Natalie and Owen exchanged a look. Brief, electric, carrying a meaning that needed no translation. Something they had counted on had just been placed in serious question. Raymond's cross-examination of Natalie was methodical, patient, and devastating in the way that patient, methodical things often are. He established, through her own testimony, that she had retained a private investigations firm 3 weeks before Eleanor Harrington had been located, before there was any named dispute to investigate. He asked her to confirm the date on which Owen Bradshaw had visited Eleanor's daughter in North Charleston. She confirmed it, apparently believing she was clarifying something minor. She had just confirmed, on the record, that a person in her employ had traveled to another state to contact a potential witness during active probate proceedings. He asked her to describe the dinner she had arranged with Eleanor 9 days prior, and specifically whether she had represented that no attorneys would be present. She confirmed it. He asked whether parties to an active legal dispute are generally advised by counsel not to engage in settlement discussions without attorney representation present. Whitfield objected, sustained on the specific legal conclusion. But the pattern was in the record. The picture it painted was in the record. And then Natalie made the mistake I think she had been building toward for weeks without knowing it. Perhaps it was the accumulated stress of watching her evidence questioned and her arguments deflected. Perhaps it was the realization that the letter was likely going to fail forensic examination. Perhaps it was simply that controlled anger, held long enough at high enough pressure, eventually insists on releasing itself regardless of the consequences. She turned in her chair, not in response to any question, not addressing the judge, not following any procedural logic, and looked directly across the room at me. "She drove my father away," Natalie said. Her voice had climbed. "She was cold and controlling, and she drove him away, and she doesn't deserve any of this. He told me what she was like." The room went very still. Judge Whitfield set down his pen. "Miss Satterley, that statement is not responsive to any question before you." "She doesn't deserve it," Natalie said again. He hadn't seen her in 46 years. She meant nothing to him at the end. "I was there. I was the one who was there." "Miss Satterley." The judge's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "You will confine your remarks to questions asked by counsel. This is your final reminder." Gregory Whitfield was already on his feet, one hand on Natalie's arm, murmuring something low and urgent. Owen Bradshaw, in the gallery, had gone completely still. Natalie sat back. She was breathing hard. The composed, carefully assembled surface of her had come apart in front of a judge, 2 attorneys, a court reporter, and whatever posterity the legal record constituted. I sat with my hands folded on the table and looked at no one in particular. I thought about the journal entry from 2003. I think about Eleanor more days than not. I wonder whether she is happy. I hope she is happy. I thought about the wildflower in the tin box. I thought about a man who had spent 46 years understanding the cost of a single cowardly decision, and who had tried, at the end, to correct it the only way still available to him. I felt no triumph, not one drop of it. Only something very old and very complicated settling into its correct place. The forensic document examination took 11 days. The report arrived at a single practical conclusion that required no translation. The handwriting in Exhibit G was not consistent with William Thomas Satterley's authenticated writing across any of the reference periods examined. The ink dating placed the document's composition within the previous 9 months. William Thomas Satterley had been dead for 15 months. The letter was a forgery. Gregory Whitfield withdrew from Natalie's representation within 48 hours of the forensic report being delivered to all parties. An attorney withdrawing from active litigation mid-case is a significant event. It communicates, without requiring a single direct statement, what the withdrawing attorney believes about his client's conduct and his own professional obligations. Natalie sought replacement counsel. 3 attorneys declined in sequence. The probate hearing reconvened for its final session 3 weeks later. Natalie appeared without legal representation. She sat alone at the table that had previously held Gregory Whitfield and his organized files and his expensive composure. She looked smaller than she had at Harborview, smaller than she had at the cafe in the Pearl District. Not smaller in a way that gave me satisfaction. She was William's daughter. She had in all likelihood genuinely cared for him in his final years, whatever her motivations. The grief underneath her actions was probably real, even if the actions themselves had been unconscionable. But she had submitted a forged document to a court of law. She had sent a man to intimidate my daughter in another state. She had orchestrated an unauthorized search of my belongings. She had made settlement approaches designed to pressure a 72-year-old woman into surrendering a legal inheritance that was rightfully hers. Those were not the actions of grief alone. Judge Whitfield did not deliberate at length. The record was complete. The documentation was thorough. The medical testimony was uncontested. The sole meaningful challenge to my standing had been built on evidence that had failed forensic examination. He looked at his papers. Then he looked up. The estate of William Thomas Satterley, valued at approximately $53 million, is awarded to Eleanor May Harrington, original married name Eleanor May Satterley, as the lawful primary beneficiary per the explicitly and competently expressed intentions of the decedent. He closed the folder in front of him with the quiet finality of a man moving to the next matter. That was all. $53 million. 46 years. A tin box and a pressed wildflower and a marriage certificate from May 17, 1973. All of it resolved in a sentence. I signed the final documents in Raymond Holloway's office that same afternoon. Arthur Fleming was present. Raymond was present. The late afternoon light came through the office window at the particular angle I had come to associate with Tacoma, sideways and silver, the way Pacific Northwest light moves in March, as though it's still making up its mind. My hand was completely steady. Arthur mentioned, as I was finishing the last signature, that William had left something else, a sealed envelope, separate from the estate documents. A handwritten note on the outside read, "For Eleanor, when the time is right." "When would you like it?" Arthur asked. "I'll take it now," I said, "but I won't open it today." I texted Beverly as I walked out of Raymond's office into the March afternoon. "It's done." She replied within 30 seconds. "Good. Biscuit and I are at the cafe. Come have coffee." I went. I did not open the envelope for 2 days. On the third morning, I made coffee in the small kitchen of my hotel room, took it to the chair by the window, and sat in the morning light with the envelope in my hands for a long moment. Then I opened it. 4 pages. William's handwriting, older than the journal entries, more deliberate. The handwriting of a man who had composed this carefully and more than once before committing it to the final version. He apologized. Not in the performed, self-protective way of people who apologize to feel better about themselves. In the way of someone who had spent considerable time understanding exactly what he had done and what it had cost, and who was not asking forgiveness so much as finally making sure the accounting was complete. He explained 1977 without excuse. The debt, the men he owed money to, the panic of a 28-year-old who had made a catastrophic mistake and could not see any path through it except away. He named his own cowardice plainly, without softening it. He wrote about the decades in Tacoma, about building a life there, about Natalie, honestly, without sentimentality. He had tried to be her father. He had not always succeeded. He had not left her the estate because he had thought carefully about what she needed, and he had concluded that money from him would not give her the thing she actually needed, which was a reckoning with her own life on its own terms. He wrote this with his precision of a man who had done his own reckoning and understood what it required. And then, near the end, I kept your photograph on my desk for 46 years. Every person who worked with me, who came to my office, who sat across that desk from me, saw it. Nobody ever asked who you were. But I knew. And knowing was the thing that kept the rest of my life honest, because I couldn't look at that photograph and pretend I was a man who had never done anything wrong. You deserved better than what I gave you. You deserved someone who stayed. I was not that person when you needed me to be. And I have lived with that knowledge every single year since. I hope the life after me was a good one. I hope there were people who saw you clearly. I hope you were not as alone as I was. I am sorry, Eleanor, not because I need you to forgive me, but because the truth deserves to be said plainly, at least once, even if it arrives 50 years late. William I folded the letter carefully. I placed it in the tin box, with the marriage certificate and the wildflower and the photographs and the 4 letters from a summer in Asheville when we were young and had no idea what was coming. I closed the lid. Then I sat for a while in the morning light and let the whole of it, all 50 years of it, be exactly what it was. Not resolved into something simple, not forgiven or unforgiven, not a happy ending or a sad one. Just true. The truth has a weight to it that is different from the weight of not knowing. It is heavier in some ways and lighter in others. Mostly it just is, solid and permanent and requiring nothing from you except that you carry it honestly. I could do that. I had been carrying things honestly my whole life. The legal consequences for Natalie unfolded in the weeks that followed with the patient, institutional thoroughness of systems that do not hurry, but do, eventually, complete themselves. Submitting a forged document in probate proceedings is a felony in Washington state. The Pierce County District Attorney's Office opened an investigation. The private investigations firm Owen Bradshaw had operated through also came under scrutiny regarding the contact with Diane in North Charleston and several jurisdictional questions that contact had raised. Owen Bradshaw disappeared from Natalie's life during this period. Beverly heard this through the network that retired judges accumulate without particularly trying. She mentioned it without elaboration, in the way she mentioned most things, as information, not commentary. 14 months later, Natalie received a suspended sentence and a substantial fine. The legal costs of her defense consumed most of what remained of her personal savings. I did not follow these developments closely. What happened to Natalie was between Natalie and the consequences of her own choices. I had my own life to attend to. Douglas, back in Charleston, heard about the estate through mutual acquaintances. Diane told me he had called her and asked a few careful questions in a voice that had lost its characteristic breezy confidence. I did not call him. When I thought of him, which was less often than I would have predicted, I felt something without drama in it. A mild, clean disinterest, the way you might feel remembering a room you once lived in that was slightly too dark and slightly too cold, and being simply glad to have moved out of it. I want to tell you about the phone call with Diane, because it matters more than any legal verdict. Diane and I had been talking more in those final weeks in Tacoma. Not about the case, which I had kept careful and contained, but about other things, small things. The way conversations between mothers and daughters sometimes have to rebuild themselves from the small things upward, one ordinary exchange at a time, until one day you realize the distance has closed without either of you having formally decided to close it. When it was all done, I called her and told her to quit her second job. She had been working 2 jobs since her own divorce 4 years prior. She refused, as I knew she would, in the immediate instinctive way of a woman who has learned to take care of herself and is proud of it. "You have 30 seconds to change your mind," I told her, "before I wire it anyway." She laughed, the kind of laugh that has been waiting a long time to come out. I laughed too. I stayed in Tacoma. This surprised me at first, and then didn't. The city was green and unhurried, with a quality I could only describe as an honest lack of pretension. It didn't work very hard to impress you, which meant the things it offered were simply what they were. The light in the mornings was particular and real. The cafe was 2 blocks away. Beverly and Biscuit were at the corner table between 8 and 9. I found an apartment in a quiet neighborhood with a courtyard garden visible from my front windows and morning light that fell the way I liked it to fall. It was the first home I had chosen entirely for myself, by myself, without accommodating anyone else's preferences or making peace with anyone else's decisions. I chose the furniture because I liked it. Not because it was the most practical or the least expensive or the option that would cause the least discussion, because I liked it. I enrolled in a watercolor class I had been deferring for 20 years. Always too busy, always something more pressing, always next year. I joined a book club that met on Thursday evenings in the back room of a bookshop 3 blocks from my apartment. I developed morning routines that were entirely my own. The walk to the cafe, the coffee with Beverly, the hour by the window with a book in the afternoon. Small things. The ordinary, unhurried fabric of a life lived on its own terms. But I had learned, I was still learning, that small things are what a life is actually made of. Not the dramatic moments, not the turning points, not the hearings and the verdicts and the $53 million. Those are the architecture. But the small things, the coffee, the morning light, the dog sleeping under the cafe table, the friend who believes you without requiring proof, those are what you actually live inside. And I was, for the first time in a very long time, living inside my own life. Dear friends, I have been Eleanor for this whole story, and what I want to leave you with tonight is not the inheritance and not the victory in the courtroom, though both of those things were real and both of them mattered. What I want to leave you with is this. Douglas Harrington could laugh at a dinner party. Natalie Satterley could forge documents and send investigators to my daughter's door. The world could put me in room 14 of the Magnolia Road Inn with a rattling heater and $18,000 and a spring in the mattress. None of it, not one single piece of it, touched what I actually was. Dignity is not something other people give you. It is not something circumstances confer. You cannot earn it by being good enough or quiet enough or accommodating enough, and you cannot lose it by being left or dismissed or laughed at by a man who poured himself a cup of coffee and told you your marriage was over. It lives somewhere deeper than any of that can reach. I am 72 years old. I was left with nothing but a suitcase and a tin box, and I held on to myself through every single thing that tried to take that from me. Not because I was exceptional, not because I was fearless, not because I never cried in room 14 at 2 in the morning with a spring poking into my ribs, but because my mother's daughter does not shake. And because I decided, on a gray February morning with a cup of instant coffee that tasted like hot water with ambitions, that the next chapter of my life was going to be written by me. It is never too late to refuse the terms someone else has set for your life. That is what I know. That is what I want you to know. Dear friends, if this story moved something in you, I would truly love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Tell me about the moment you decided to hold on to yourself. And if you know a woman, a mother, a sister, a friend, a neighbor, who needs to hear tonight that she is not finished, that nobody gets to decide that for her, that the next chapter has not been written yet, Please share this story with her. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. That means more than I can properly say.